good evening to you. This is The Full View here on SABC News Channel. Thank you so much for joining us on this day on which we reflect and celebrate the 7th anniversary of former President Nelson Mandela's passing. The Nelson Mandela Foundation marks the day every year by commemorating Madiba's life, drawing on his values to speak to critical issues. And this year's commemoration is an online event named The Bonds That Bind Us, remembering Madiba in a time of a global fracture. It'll have various speakers there, including the First Lady of Namibia, Mama Graça Machel, to reflect on it. And right now, Tsitsi Dangarembga is a speaking poet, novelist, and political activist. So she is talking about the framing of what solidarity and responsibility is in a region and what leaders should do for their people. Of course, all of this against the backdrop of COVID-19. And remember, we are also asking about Madiba, what this day means to us and how we should reflect on his life. Let's take you to that event live. Please do engage with us.
Grown up under conditions of Black domination. Many of us cannot imagine a world in which Black people do not dominate other Black people. And I continue with this idea for a little, but then I go on to say, Nelson Mandela told us, those who can't imagine change reveal the deficits of their imaginations, not the difficulty of change. It is true, it is difficult to imagine change when one has been locked into a specific world. It is even more difficult to imagine change when the situation one is locked into is a situation of unending anxiety, distress, and even terror. It is a debilitating existential terror. However, Mandela also told us how we can overcome such a dreadful situation. Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. In saying this, the first president of South Africa told us how we can become the kinds of people who can imagine change. He told us we can become the kinds of people who can imagine change through education for change. We need education in the values which point to our commonalities rather than to our differences and divisions. We need education that frees the mind to imagine dignified, prosperous, common futures that we have not yet seen. We need education in creativity and in the products of creativity. These products of creativity include the arts. I go on to say why arts are important in this process of education for change, and you will be able to read this yourselves. I then go on to talk about the challenge of interesting, influential, and resourced Africans in changing the subjective life of the continent, especially through the arts. We see that the subjectivity exhibited by today's Africans appears to support the objectives of currently influential and many wealthy Africans. Resource Africans are more inclined to channel their resources towards material and political ends because these things are seen as being practical and real, to the neglect of the education that changes the way we look at the world. And of course, there are practical things that we can do to promote justice and a concept of a shared humanity. One of them is to advocate for the responsibility to protect. The responsibility to protect is a United Nations fostered norm which puts upon nations the responsibility to act when the citizens of a certain nation are subjected to persecution of a devastating order, which they are not equipped to relieve themselves of by themselves. It is this responsibility to act which Nelson Mandela referred to when he said, I believe that we must all accept that we cannot abuse the concept of national sovereignty to deny the rest of the continent the right and duty to intervene when, behind those sovereign boundaries, people are being slaughtered to protect tyranny. I also go on to talk about some NGO programs, but I do point out that such NGO programs are by nature designed to impact relatively small numbers of people and not to engender the far-reaching systemic change that is necessary for fostering a notion of a shared humanity. I then take a different note and I talk about solidarity between groups across our borders that have outlived their usefulness and become a liability to us. And I suggest that the former liberation movements here in SADC are some such groupings. These liberation movements are cemented through their militaristic ideology. However, different orders of liberation are required today. Thus, I say wealthy resource Africans across the board, including those in our militaristic governments, would do well to allow themselves to be educated for change. And then I conclude by saying that as Mandela's walk to freedom was long, so should we not expect the walk of our continent or the walk of the globe of which our continent is a part to freedom to be short. However, my greater concern at this juncture is with our continent. The walk of the different regions, nations, groups, and individuals of our continent to freedom will be long. To attain our goal, we are called upon to educate ourselves and each other for change. The objective of this education for change is to expand our imaginations so that we can imagine free, prosperous conditions that we desire together and share together, and thus motivate an ongoing long walk towards this vision, in the knowledge that this prosperity and freedom can only be true prosperity and freedom when it is the prosperity and freedom of all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tsitsi. I think for us, you've given us some things to think about. As an archivist, I must tell you, I was struggling with changing Madiba's words and playing with them, but I see where you were going. You got me there. And I'm hoping that others will just also play along in order for us to reimagine a future we want. I'd like to now at this point call on the First Lady of Namibia, Monica Geingos, to please address us.
So thank you very much. It's such an honor to be on the same platform as Mama Grasa and Tsitsi. I'm going to boast to my daughter today that Tsitsi called me Madame Geingos. So while we're on that topic, please, all of you, call me Monica. And as a big fan, I'd like to really just continue where she stopped. And I'll also condense a lot of what I wanted to say so that we can get into the panel discussion. And just really reflect on the question that was asked by the Nelson Mandela Foundation of how do we construct a social contract that transcends borders. And to me, we must recognize the intricacies that undermine the social contract. And not knowing enough of one another's histories creates fertile ground to sow the poisonous seeds that compromise our collective futures. And history has shown us time and time again that when we dehumanize others and we construct dehumanizing narratives of others, great evil follows. And as we think about how do we extend these cross-border social contracts, I think we need to evaluate the state of our domestic social cohesion. Said differently, how do we strengthen a cross-border social contract when our domestic social contract appears to be unraveling? And as we continue to grapple with the issues of tribalism, racism, it does beg the question of how will we accept and embrace non-citizens when we don't necessarily embrace and accept one another as citizens? I'm not going to deal with the issues that we were asked to speak about in relation to COVID. I think I want to condense what I want to say and just speak to, Tsitsi was talking a lot about the us and the we and how we define ourselves. And one of the challenges I see there is one of the things that we need to urgently do in defining ourselves is really developing a sense of identity that not only defines us, but also unites us. So when we speak about the shared identities, also the need to restore the dignity of our people, because when people feel or have been dehumanized, it makes it easier for them to dehumanize others. So when Tsitsi talks about the I also hear and concerned about the increasing transactional nature of our politics, where we increasingly think about the I as opposed to the we. But the I has no interest in protecting the group if the I feels left behind. So we do need to have difficult conversations from top to bottom on who we are and what our values are. I also want to just quickly touch on the fair allocation of resources and redistribution of wealth being key to a cohesive society, because with its tribalism, racism, xenophobia, the othering of those who are not like us is often about competition for resources. And it's easier to deny resources to those who we convince ourselves are not as deserving as we are. And we must find urgent mechanisms to enable the fair allocation of opportunity in the public and private sector, whether it's in relation to employment, how people enter and exit our borders, law enforcement, procurement strategies, the provision of social services. There must be fair allocation. And the moment that citizens feel they're overlooked for employment in favor of others, that borders are corruptly managed, that some have preferential procurement privileges, or that they are unable to access services as others are taking up space in hospitals or schools, that's the moment when people on the ground turn against each other. Something quickly I also want to talk about is how leaders, communities, and sometimes even the media must understand that shaming people doesn't change how they feel. And I've seen a lot of conversations where countries are called very, very xenophobic. And this conversation is often tinged with some hypocrisy, because when we label groups of people, that's the essence of discrimination. The same way we can't reasonably claim that all Nigerians are drug dealers. We also can't call all South Africans xenophobes, for instance. So we need honest conversations on why people feel the way they do and fix those challenges without scapegoating others. Tsitsi was a little bit more direct about leadership and political will than what I can be, but it is key. And at times, leaders must be willing to lose political mileage in defense of the values that bind and define a society. It's important to be willing to do what's right and not what's convenient. The fact that we see division being used as a political strategy does add to societal polarization. And it's not lost on us that polarization is most pronounced during election seasons, often triggered by political and community leaders. And we must hold leaders accountable when they say and do things that stoke prejudice for the sake of short-term political expediency. I wanted to talk a little bit about language, but I think we're running out of time. So I want to talk about teaching Pan-African history in our schools. I think as Africans, we don't know each other well enough. There are South Africans who don't know the shared history with Namibia. There are Namibians who don't know our shared history with Zimbabwe, and vice versa. And it's harder to construct negative stereotypes of people when you understand who they are. I also want to dwell and talk a little bit about fighting misinformation in all its forms. And our social media is being increasingly used as an echo chamber for the prejudiced to spread rumors and strengthen negative stereotypes, and how xenophobic sentiment, for instance, is often instigated and spread through unverified rumors on WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter. And we must fight misinformation, particularly when it has such bloody consequences. We must fact check and hold our politicians accountable when they spread fake news, which triggers xenophobic sentiment. And I think the role of the media and civil society is critical in this regard. Tsitsi talked about the responsibility to act. And I do think we do need to have more attention paid to the push factors that results in our communities and our people clashing with those that they don't recognize as one of them. And we need to discuss the importance of treating people as human beings, regardless of their nationality. And we also need to ask the reasons why people are leaving their countries. And again, Tsitsi was able to articulate herself much stronger than what I can. And we do often hear about sovereign states not interfering in one another's affairs. And the reality is that the spillover of national crises does not respect borders. I can't imagine the dilemma a country like South Africa may face in navigating the complex space of respecting the sovereignty of a problematic country while being forced to absorb the economic, social, and political impact of that country's instability. So that responsibility to act can be looked at through this prism. We also need to recognize ourselves as post-conflict societies. And the soul of our respective nations are wounded by our past. We have wounded people, we have wounded leaders who have not overcome their difficult experiences. And they inflict their wounds on their people. And we need to start identifying with what it means to be a post-conflict society and the measures needed to fix our societal dysfunction. An example would be the high levels of violence that characterize many of our countries. And violence has become a communication tool within the family, within the community, with devastating consequences with how we deal with conflict. And these same individuals who are so angry at poor service delivery that they can burn a library, a clinic, or a school to communicate their unhappiness with government will be the same individuals who think nothing of beating, stabbing, and burning a Mozambican national as a way to chase foreigners out of their settlements. So we must tend to our wounds. We must invest in psychosocial support and focus on reducing the violence that is almost ingrained in some of our communities, both at an individual level and at a state level. So we need compassionate and competent leaders who don't look away and scapegoat their failings. And we also need compassionate and caring communities who resolve conflict in a constructive manner. Essentially, the essence of what I was trying to say in all of those points is that we need more Madibas. We need more leaders who are able to overcome their wounds and help others to do the same. And the Madiba leadership model needs to transcend politics and enter into the hearts and minds of our traditional and religious leaders, our political leaders. It needs to enter the corridors of academia, of business, of sport, and all leadership levels, because we need to embrace the philosophy, the Madiba philosophy of forgiveness, tolerance, unity, and honesty. And we're reminded that we should remember Madiba, but we shouldn't forget the context in which his views were forged. 7 years since his passing feels like a short period of time, but so much has happened. And we must understand the same dangers he saw in the danger of dividing people. We must understand the danger of using division as a political strategy, the danger of hatred towards one another, and the danger of a divided Africa that does not intervene, as Tsitsi had mentioned before. I wanted to speak a little bit about the African Continental Free Trade Area, and how the movement of goods cannot be discussed if we don't want to talk about the movement of people, and how we speak about the movement of people if we don't accept one another and our differences. So that's essentially what I wanted to say quickly within the short allocation of time that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. We heard you. I think your point about how can you begin to even imagine a future with others when internally you've got strife too, that social contract shouldn't be expected to work outside of the boundaries of your country when it doesn't actually work in your own country. So thank you for that input. As questions keep streaming in on our platform, I'd like you to just pause for a second to hear Madiba speak about this issue of how to tackle the issue of a pandemic. What kind of leadership we need at a point like this. And as we speak of fractures, it's good to hear Madiba speak for himself when he was addressing the question of the AIDS pandemic. Let's watch Madiba speak about this.
the greatest challenges we face is gaping and growing disparities between countries and regions around the world. It requires bold and visible action by top leadership at all levels of society. We have to act. We have to act decisively, and above all, we must work together. The answer to turning around the devastating impact of this epidemic lies within us.
Thank you very much again to Anand Singh and the Video Vision team for reminding us of Madiba's words. I want us to go back to our panelists and maybe just take a few moments about the kind of questions that you started, or rather the provocation that you gave us. I want to start with Tsitsi. How do we maintain the responsibility to protect citizens of the world and those outside of our narrow nationalism? And this also is reflected on what the First Lady said earlier on, so I'm connecting the two. So if I know you said we shouldn't call you I'm struggling with calling you Monica. So I'm hoping to get it right, that I'll at least call you Monica at some point. Tsitsi, over to you. You are muted.
Thank you, Selo. I'm also struggling. I'm struggling with Monica, and I would like to say First Lady Monica, if I may. So yes, I think the point that First Lady Monica mentioned is really important. If we are not healed within ourselves, there is no way that we can extend anything that is positive or healing beyond our borders. And so I think because we do not have time and the situation is so pressing, we need to look at healing within our borders as well as healing in aggregates that go beyond our borders. For example, our regions, SADC shares very similar histories. And so the kinds of healing that we need are very similar, and we need to engage with that. In my section of the arts, I speak about how the arts can help with healing the wounds when we see what has been done to us, and we are able to realize that we are the way we are for good reasons. We can then be more open to change. And so I think that process of a social contract which originates within the borders and then is extended beyond the borders in a framework of healing is one of the most important things that we need to do. I'd just like to quickly say that in our African tradition, we prize being strong. We don't like to admit to our weaknesses and the need for healing. This kind of psychological internal healing can be seen as a weakness. And this is something we have to move away from. We have to realize that if we do not deal with those internal wounds, they are going to manifest externally and lead to our destruction.
To go back to the First Lady, you were speaking about how these social bonds need to also go beyond borders. Is it possible to imagine these social bonds of interdependency that extend outside of national borders? And how does that become a reality? So you touched on how just the question of race and tribalism, for example. But how do we go make this possible?
I think so, and I want to go back to the clip you showed us about Madiba speaking about pandemics. and how pandemics are so reoccurring, but how little we learn from pandemic to pandemic. And if there's a pandemic that really characterizes how fragile global solidarity is, it potentially is COVID. We saw the behavior around procurement and distribution of PPE. We saw the behavior around COVID relief measures, where in some countries, non-nationals weren't given any form of social welfare assistance. We saw the conversation and how it's developing around vaccines. So the issue of solidarity within a country, solidarity within a region, and global solidarity is something we're paying a lot of lip service to. And I think we need some more tangible measures, so more tangible mechanisms to ensure that solidarity is not only spoken about, that it actually translates into how we formulate policy and implement decisions. And I think part of it is what we're discussing about healing. Another aspect is about recognizing the moment we're in and the need for a more intergenerational leadership. Tsitsi made a comment earlier about liberation movements in Southern Africa. And I think a lot of restoration of the things that we can see are going wrong can be resolved through leadership that is more diverse, inclusive, and includes more young people who may think about some of these subjects a bit differently from what a leadership that's not inclusive may be thinking. So I think, Selo, it's really, and also recognizing the humanity of others, especially those who don't look like us, those who don't speak the same language as we do, and those who find themselves in our countries. If I'm not mistaken, the Freedom Charter in South Africa speaks about South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. It doesn't say South Africa belongs to South Africans. It's to all those who live in it. And some of those who live in it are not South Africans. And us understanding the need as South Africa, as Namibia, as Botswana, as Lesotho, as Zimbabwe, Mozambique, to build countries that work for all those who live in it.
Because it leads to the question that was posted on our platform from Hans Basman, who asks Tsitsi this question: is there a difference between indivisibility and Ubuntu? And if yes, what is it?
Yes, I think there is a difference between indivisibility and Ubuntu, in that I would say indivisibility is a subset of Ubuntu. Indivisibility, as used by Mandela in that quote, refers to freedom. Ubuntu refers to all the ways that we have of behaving. It refers to the way individuals treat each other with graciousness and kindness and respect, with the humanity that First Lady Monica has been speaking of. If we all behave with Ubuntu, we will by default have indivisibility of freedom.
I guess it again goes back to the question that the platform has been putting up, and I want to encourage all our viewers to keep going with your questions. A question to you, First Lady, from Robin Fester. He's asking, what are the limits of us? How large can the substantive and effective scope of those we are able to conceive as part of us? Because I liked how you kept on saying, actually, this us needs to grow bigger. And Robin is saying, how big should that be going? Making the circle bigger, how big should that be?
Somehow I knew you were going to say make the circle bigger. And it is exactly that. How do we make the circle bigger? And we make it by a construct where we realize that we as a group, we as individuals do not thrive on our own, we thrive as a group. But the group can't thrive if there's individuals in the group who are barely surviving. And those who are barely surviving have no incentive to protect the greater good, the us, if they don't benefit from what the group should be providing, which is protection, nurturing of everybody. So I think it's really understanding that we're stronger as groups, not as individuals, and where we benefit as individuals when the group does well. The group can never do well when there's people being left behind. Whether it's being left behind and Robin, one of the challenges, especially in Southern Africa, is that the fault lines in our societies are drawn on racial, ethnic lines, which are very dangerous and which often translate themselves into violent words and conduct towards one another. And it's because we don't appreciate that we all do need each other. It sounds so corny to say it, but that's the reality. We cannot, as a group, thrive when others are barely surviving. And we've got too many people barely surviving in our countries. And they have no interest or incentive to protect the greater group. And we need to reformulate that. And whether that's through talking about redistribution of wealth, which is a very unpopular topic in both Namibia and South Africa, even though we're the first and second most unequal countries in the world, the fair allocation of resources and making sure that everybody has an interest in the group thriving.
You know, you're reminding me of the words of the UN Secretary General when he gave the Nelson Mandela annual lecture recently in July. In fact, he said there's this falsehood that we spread that says we are in this together. He says that's not true. Some are in yachts and speedboats, whereas others are just holding onto the rafters, just barely surviving. And it's on this question that I want to go back to you, Tsitsi, about violence. To what extent does state violence actually end up spilling over into homes? That it becomes normalized to also have domestic violence, because our woundedness, which the First Lady touched on, and you also touched on about woundedness, to what extent does that woundedness actually spill over into state violence, but also come back into our homes?
Yes, Selo, that's a very important question, and I think it links to the it links to the previous question, which is what are the limits of us? First Lady Monica has given a perspective on that, and I just wanted to pick up on that and say that the very question itself comes from a place of anxiety. It comes from a place of perception of lack, as I understand it. It seems to me that that kind of question comes from a place of, oh, if there are more in the group, there will not be enough for me. So many studies have shown that there are enough resources in this world for everybody. And one group will never grow so big because there are many groups. So there is a way that we can have principles and norms that ensure that the group does not need to grow so big that it disintegrates. So these are anxieties that we have because of the lack that we have engineered by the way we live, which is engendered, as First Lady Monica said, by inequality. And definitely many countries here on the continent of Africa are amongst some of the most unequal. Now, to go to the question of violence, there comes a time when violence becomes a norm. First Lady Monica has already spoken about that. And definitely, if I look back at Zimbabwe and I look at the whole history of Zimbabwe going back into pre-colonial history, we have a history of violence. Some people would like to say that the history of pre-colonial Africa, this part of the world, pre-colonial Zimbabwe, is utopian. It is not at all utopian. we have had interactions with different ethnicities on the continent. Excuse me, we've had these interactions with different ethnicities in our regions going back millennia. Going back 1 millennium, we have had interactions with Arab people who were slave traders. The kind of slave trading that was brought by the Arabs was a devastating kind of slave trading. But it also made people from the continent engage in that practice. And so when you read through the history, as I have been doing for a project I'm working on, you hear about whole areas in Malawi, in Tanzania, in the north of Zambia, Burundi, Uganda, being devastated, villages completely wiped out because of the slave trade. That is a history of violence. We hear about people who would sell their own child for some fish or for some cloth or for some beads. These are things we did, and we did them as late as the 19th century, maybe even the early 20th century, whether we like it or not. So we have a history of violence. And onto those kinds of endemic violence that we had the violence of colonization. People do not talk about the violence of Cecil John Rhodes in this part of the world. The war that was fought in the Harare area of Zimbabwe in the 1890s was one of the bloodiest wars that were fought, but people don't talk about it. That was again inculcating into us a culture of violence. Then came the liberation struggle, which really was a very violent struggle. Some of the things that were done by people, Black liberators, who said, "We are liberating you," are unspeakable. And then, as often happens after those kinds of liberation wars, there were what political scientists call a war of conquest on the Ndebele people in the south of the country. And that is the political science term I've been told for genocide. Again, even after independence and the objectives of liberation had been achieved, we again engaged in gross violence. So really, this is the way we behave, and that is at the level of the state. What the state validates will definitely become a way of life. Thus it is that people who are aligned with the state feel it is all right to go and pull people off the streets and put them into cars and drive them out to certain places and beat them and torture them. This is happening in Zimbabwe. We know it's going, and everybody is afraid. We don't talk about it. We don't act against it. Nobody empowers us to take decisive action against that kind of thing, to say, look, this is a wounded way of behaving. This kind of behavior is the behavior of wounded beings, and we have to fix it. Now, in this kind of environment, where we then have an economic impact, where resources are increasingly scarce, so that people are on the streets all day to make sure that they eat once a day, there is going to be increased tension. And this increased tension is going to lead to conflict between individuals. One thing that shocked me for a long time and continues to shock me, that it's quite normal to walk down a street in a city here in Zimbabwe and hear someone joking about, oh, I'm going to beat you up so badly. It is so much part of our culture that we do not even understand that that kind of talk is talk which perpetuates violence. It is violent itself. So I think the state does need to take the lead in eradicating violence. As long as the state tolerates violence, as long as the state promotes violence, often, as First Lady Monica said, at times where state power, political power is challenged, election times, referendums, and that kind of thing, we are going to have a culture of violence. We on the ground can do what we try, and we can reach small numbers of people. But unless some of these initiatives are state-led, we are not going to turn over and move away from and take a break with our past, which is centuries long and full of violence.
Thank you very much for that. First Lady, I want to connect two questions for you. The one is something that you wanted to touch on, but because of time you couldn't, on language. And Madiba says that if 27 years in prison taught him anything, is that words can give life or take it, and that words matter. And I would like you to just take us to that question of language. But as you do so, that you also respond to Kululiwe, who thanks both of you for your insightful contributions. But then she says, those in power perpetuate divisions, the very divisions that you were talking about, First Lady. How do we achieve the kind of unity that you were talking about without completely overhauling the system?
Yeah. So we've seen, even in developed countries where leaders were elected on the back of a very divisive platform, and who deepened divisions as a political strategy through language, through violent language, and always othering others. And I want to just quickly reflect even on the question of state violence. Does that filter into the home, or to maybe look at it differently and say to ourselves, if our state is violent, it's because we are violent. We need implementers for state violence. We need people who believe that what they're doing lacks consequence. It lacks accountability. And it makes me think of a soldier fighting a war that's not honorable. And when they held account, whether it's the Nazis, whether it's the Germans who genocided Namibians here in Namibia, whether it was South African soldiers fighting for the apartheid state, they tend to say, it wasn't me. I was just following orders. And state violence cannot exist without people who believe that that violence is in their benefit. So the violence of the state is driven by fear of their own people, and the violence within our homes, particularly the violence of men, is driven by both fear and a sense of powerlessness. So when we start using violence to assert our power, whether as individuals or as a state, you know that there's something very wrong in our understanding of how to resolve conflict at individual or state level. And then to go to that question of language and how words matter. Words do matter. And you find a lot of the problematic sentiments articulated by leaders in the public space being articulated by those who follow them or who share similar views. And we've seen leaders, whether it's opposition, whether it's ruling parties, say incredibly problematic things because they're pandering to what they believe the masses are thinking and saying. And that pandering is a problem, and we must hold accountable. But I also want to talk language in its literal form, Selo, and say, I remember when I was younger and I was in South Africa and somebody spoke to me in one of the South African indigenous languages, and I wouldn't be able to respond, or I responded in English. I would be called you Model C, which was a identifier of class, that they accept me as a person, but they think I'm better than them because I'm responding in English. And now it's changed from being called Model C to being called Kwere Kwere. So we are now using language as a way to divide one another, to see if this person is the same as me. If this person doesn't speak my language, it means they don't belong here. And that's why we're hearing even national leaders talking about go back to where you came from. And that's violent language. And using your language, if I get into a taxi or I call a doctor's office and the receptionist insists on speaking to me in their language, or the taxi driver I get into insists on speaking to me in the language they speak, that is violent, because you are deciding how to treat me and how much respect you should accord to me based on whether I can speak your language or not. So language from the perspective of both our indigenous languages and how we try and force them on others, but also language in terms of how we speak in the public domain. And to me, a political leader has the same responsibility as a religious leader, as a traditional leader. When we start to speak about them, about foreigners, in the bad old days of apartheid, where you would hear about hulle. So this concept of hulle, them, we've internalized it as Black people, and we continue to separate ourselves from others and decide how we treat others based on whether we recognize the language they speak, whether they speak our language, and whether the language that my leader said to me yesterday, that these people are stealing my jobs, it's because of these people that I don't have access to resources. They're telling me I should hate others. So yes, words do matter. And it is important to hold those in our societies who use violent words and division as a way to consolidate their short-term ambitions. Because once you divide people, it's easier to divide people than to unite them. And we're seeing many leaders take the easy way out of embracing division.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. I've got so many questions for you from the Commissioner of the CRL Rights Commission, Renir Skuman, for example. There's a lot of questions, but we don't have much time. So I'll close with this last question from Pearl Naidoo Mputi, who asks the question to both of you as you wrap up. Which three words would you say clearly outline the bonds that bind us? Which three words would you say clearly outline the bonds that bind us? Tsitsi? You didn't hear the question? So it's a question from Pearl Naidoo Mputi, who says, which three words would you say clearly outline the bonds that bind us? So just three words that you think clearly outline the bonds that bind us.
Identifying with, it's four, relationship building. Those are the three words.
There's still three, even though there are four. So thank you so much.
You can make one of them hyphenated, like relationship building, relationship hyphen building.
Thank you so much for that. First Lady, as you close, your three words.
So to me, it's healing, it is self-leadership, and it's forgiveness.
All three are themes that Madiba cared deeply about, and thank you for that. As we are now about to close, as we get towards the end, I want to thank both of you for these thoughtful and challenging provocations. You've given us a lot to think about. And as we draw to a close, now it is my singular honor to call on Megra Samashel to come and give us her reflections. Ma'am, again, one is really grateful that you gave us the time that you have given us.
Well, what an afternoon. I really would like to thank very deeply my two daughters who have taken us to look inwards, of each one of us, look at what our countries have become, and even to recognize that there's very little left of what we once called SADC as a home for all of us. Very little in practical terms. So instead of me trying to make comments on what I have listened and observed, perhaps I will say why I came to this house today. I decided to be on the 5th December in this space, which hundreds of times Madiba walked in his way. He greeted each and everyone he met, looking into the eyes. Madiba will never greet you without looking into your eyes and say, I'm so honored to meet you, or I'm so honored to see you. And for the people he worked with, every morning he would say, hello, how are you? How is you? And he will mention the names of the husband, of the daughter, of the son, of the father. He knew it was not only that person who happened to be on a daily lives working with him, and but it was his or her family, and they were all part of his caring, and to want to know how they are doing. And then I wanted also, just for my emotional reasons, just to touch the spaces he touched. He walks in these corridors, I don't know how many times. And as I look at the chairs there, I can see him sitting while he was listening to the kind of programs which took place in this foundation. So I needed to be here. I needed to feel myself with his presence. In a way, perhaps I could say I touch it better than what it is, his presence in my life. So it made me feel how, being so short time, he has left us. But what the transformations which have been taking place in our lives, in our nations, in our region, in our continent and the world, they're so profound that you hardly can recognize really many of the things which are inside us, but on a daily basis they just seem to be just disappearing. I started by saying it's this caring for one another. People will say it's because we have the crisis of COVID. But no. Long before we had the COVID crisis, we have been losing the ability of connecting with one another, and to care for one another, and to feel that my life has only a meaning if the person who is here, who is part of me, if he or she is well. We have been losing this. And this we can try to explain in many ways as, what is the responsibility of the state, what is the responsibility of the landscape, the political landscape in which we are. But basically, I want to say that, as Madiba was saying, it's in our hands. It's every single one of us who has to reconnect with others. And for that, you don't need a law, you don't need a structure, you just have to find ways of reconnecting and caring for others. And to understand that you are hollow if you don't feel yourself with the relating to others and to feel that others are well as well. I don't know how to express this. It's not very easy to me. And I think this region has changed so much. And to be really very honest, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to have our states or our leaders as states to take us back to what we have been in terms of connection. I don't know what happened. I was in government until late 80s. So I'm so glad that I have been in a civil society landscape where I always communicate and in contact with people. And I think that has helped me to keep, my identity in the kind of person I am. But I can see some of my brothers and sisters who have been in power and who are of my generation, in fact, that I don't know what happened. But it's just so difficult to recognize in them the same people. I'm talking of those of my generation. It's extremely difficult to, but what happened to them? Or perhaps I should say, what happened to me? That I just don't feel we have the same connection as we used to have. So I think it's going to be extremely difficult if we leave it at that level. My reflection as I listen to my daughters is, we really have to go back to the social movements which made us connect with one another in this region. I did not need to know whether someone is from Namibia or is Botswana or is from Angola. I didn't need to, because there were those social movements who were helping us to communicate and connect around issues. And this is absent today. So I think if we are to help to redefine and reinvent our societies, we really have to go back to social movements. So I'm going now to give you another task, Selo, with all the foundations I know, all the organizations which I have been involved in, to say, and you know what, we shouldn't have dialogues because today is the 5th December, or it's because it's the Women's Day, or it's because, no, we shouldn't have all those. We need to connect on a permanent basis. And this means what? Help you, because you have institutions for that. Help us to connect young people from the region to talk amongst themselves, to share their anguish, to share the successes, the doubts they have, but they have to talk. If they touch each other around issues, they will connect. And those distances between country to country will become less and less meaningful. Youth, unions, women, you name it, business, go even to academics, the academia, with issues around those who are working the same issues, but to think in terms of how can we take knowledge, how can we take to people and to connect with people. Without connection, we can talk, we can say what we have to do. Who is we? Will be we when I know it's Maria who is in Botswana. It is Monica who is in the case. It's Monica who is people. They have to be people, concrete. They're not numbers. And we have lost the ability to connect with people. We deal much more with the numbers and ideas in abstract. So I think 2021. Fortunately now, because of new technologies which are allowing us to talk, you can do it. It's a month, every month, or it's every 2 months. Just do reconnect people in this region. Give them a space and a platform to talk about the issues they care about, and allow a space in which they can dream together. They can fight together against all the issues which we know they are dividing us, but they can build together what binds us, and to know what kind of societies we want, all of us, listening to different groups, what kind of societies we want. That society doesn't mean in one boundaries of one country. All of us as a region. That's what is going to strengthen us. Because those who are being repressed, they can try and fight. They will not be able to get out of it within those spaces which is so rigid. But if they are connected, there's Tsitsi. Today, Tsitsi is a Zimbabwean, but Tsitsi has spoken to, has spoken not only to the region, she has spoken to Africa, she has spoken to the world. That's what we need using. So we have to break the physical boundaries which are being imposed on us and use technology, to build the space which is free, in which we have a sense of belonging, in which we strengthen one another, and to say societies we want are 1, 2, 3, and how we are going to get there. Thank you. That's Madiba, I know.
Thank you, Ma'am Michelle. Ma'am, every time you come to speak on this platform, one is always touched by your grace, and your wisdom remains a resource that we constantly draw on. Thank you for taking my calls. Sometimes so late at night that I feel guilty, and you still take them, and I would have been surprised if you didn't give us a task. So we will, I looked at Khalil, who I think was taking notes about what we need to do next, connecting people. And it's in the same vein of connecting people that I want to remind the viewers out there that tomorrow we will be continuing with the Mandela Walk and Run, which can be taken from anywhere around the world. Ma'am, I'm so happy to tell you that we have Namibians who started doing it today and tomorrow. We've got people in Zimbabwe, Zambia, the DRC. We've got people in Germany, Belgium, in the Netherlands. We have people in Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia. So as you know, Australia is always ahead. They finished today, and we will follow them again tomorrow. So it remains for me to thank everyone who has contributed to today's event. To our speakers, of course, again, a heartfelt thank you. I'm still resisting calling you anything but the First Lady. Tsitsi Dangarembga, thank you very much for your contribution. And of course, Geingos, thank you very much for your contribution. To our funding partner, the Untitled Foundation, you are always there for us whenever we call. Thank you to our sign language interpreters, Ausdima Katsomutimele, and Kendall Chaplin, who did a fantastic job. They remind me that on that day when Madiba was buried, there was a sign.
The CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, as you know, today is the 7th anniversary of former President Nelson Mandela's passing. We're asking how should we preserve his legacy. How the foundation did it was to have a dialogue. You saw there with well-known novelist and political activist Tsitsi Dangarembga and Namibia's First Lady to talk about the theme, the bonds that bind us, remembering Madiba in a time of global fracture. Both Monica Geingos and Tsitsi Dangarembga giving a very spirited discussion on how to do that, talking about change and the role of education. And Grasa Michelle speaking about the pain of losing Madiba and how she had to walk the hallways of the Nelson Mandela Foundation in order to touch everything that he touched, the lives that he touched, the projects that he touched. And that's how we end that hour. So you share your views. So how do we honor his legacy? Hashtag Full View +2766 479 the number to use 8056. And of course you can go to sabcnews.com to watch any of our features and interviews.